a fifth round of talks between Iran and the US to try to reach a deal over Tehran's nuclear program is today underway in Rome, and we're told it has now ended. The negotiations have been taking place since April, with the Gulf state of Oman playing a mediating role. The US has insisted that Iran must scrap its uranium enrichment program to prevent the country from developing nuclear weapons. Well, for more on these stories, let's speak now to the international affairs analyst, Dr. Marek Laskiewicz, who joins me on the line from London. Good to see you, Dr. Laskiewicz. And it was let's start with Israel. It was the humanitarian situation in Gaza that caused the UK, France and Canada to release a statement condemning Israel's action and threatening sanctions. And that didn't go down well with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, did it?
Indeed not. But this is one of the problems with dealing with Israel, similar to one mentioned before with Ukraine, that the slightest criticism and straight away the Prime Minister and the President and Prime Minister of Canada have all been accused of being pro-Hamas. They're not pro-Hamas. The point is their point here about excessive force being used, disproportionate, correct or not? And actually, President Netanyahu, Prime Minister Netanyahu, never replied on that point. He merely stated that any criticism at all is automatically pro-Hamas. Well, that's not the case. At least he ought to at least demonstrate why it is pro-Hamas by answering the point of what he proposes to do to avoid the humanitarian crisis, which of course prompt this very strong communique in the first place.
So is there now a sense that Mr. Netanyahu feels he's been backed into a corner? I mean, I understand that statement and the threats of concrete actions against Israel are really causing problems for Mr. Netanyahu in terms of public perception.
Yes, he has also been criticized internally in exactly the same way, and therefore is facing criticism from both sides, internal and external. It is true America has so far said nothing. On the other hand, America has not come out with any signs of support for Prime Minister Netanyahu either. And therefore, he is now an increasingly isolated figure. It is quite clear, of course, that without his fellow right-wingers, his government would fall, and therefore he is almost duty-bound from that side to carry on the war, because otherwise this government will fall, which will be a problem for him personally as well, because of course he is threatened with being taken to court. And therefore, he is in a corner. He has lashed out, but I don't believe that the lashing out will deter this criticism from abroad, because more is coming from other countries. On top of that, the criticisms come, you could argue, late in the day, harsh criticism, instead of some more criticism slightly less harsh before, to at least warn him. But whether any such warnings would make any difference is, of course, debatable. The point is, he now faces isolation, and for the first time, action taken against Israel in the form of sanctions, which is, please note, almost unheard of. Let us see what he will do, but I do not believe that his statements today will deter the criticism of Israel from mounting. His key action will be how much aid is he prepared to let through.
Indeed, and I wonder how his retaliatory accusations are being seen in the UK where you are, because Mr. Netanyahu is suggesting that Sir Keir Starmer, who is the UK Prime Minister, as well as the French and Canadian leaders, want Hamas to stay in power in Gaza, and that they were emboldening Hamas to continue fighting forever and had bought into its propaganda. And he accused them of being on the wrong side of justice, humanity and history. I mean, how are all those really quite extraordinary remarks going down in the UK?
Well, for a start, some of them are somewhat silly. Wrong side of history. What's that supposed to mean? When Khrushchev said that he was, so to speak, Russia was on the right side of history, went wrong. In any case, it's quite clear here that the history could go either way, in the sense that there is no right or wrong side. Now, as for the others, they are making a point about the humanitarian aspect, which he never actually replied to. Moreover, and here comes the point, he stated that there was a de facto Palestinian state in Gaza, but it was never de jure, because he has stated, please note, for years on end, there will be no Palestinian state, de jure, and indeed a full Palestinian state of any sort, because his de facto one was not a full Palestinian state, or as long as it's on his watch. And in a very real sense, the reason why Hamas was voted in is because the frustrations that the Palestinians feel, and because they would like a state like other people. And from this point of view, the central problem is that if Prime Minister Netanyahu and the Israelis are unwilling to recognize a Palestinian state, then what are the Palestinians to do? 6,000 years of history have shown that people are prepared to fight for their freedom, and this is one aspect. On the other hand, and here he has made a strong point, Hamas is dedicated to the destruction of Israel. So on this point, there would appear to be clear lines of negotiation, because please remember this has happened before. When before the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO, was fighting Israel, finally it was admitted, they admitted the state of Israel. Negotiations are possible. Peace is possible. Egypt and Syria have signed peace treaties with Israel. So it is not impossible, but it takes negotiation. And as it happens, Prime Minister Netanyahu is unwilling to make the negotiations towards a Palestinian state, and Hamas is unwilling to cease trying to destroy Israel. Here is the problem. But again, negotiations are in principle possible.
Indeed. Let's turn briefly to the Iran-US negotiations, a fifth round of talks to try to reach a deal over Tehran's nuclear program, I'm told has just ended in Rome. How high are the stakes?
Well, they're very high, and unfortunately, the very fact we're talking about a fifth round has, of course, one good point. They're still talking, but that's about the only good point. It's quite clear they cannot come to an agreement because America wants Iran to be effectively a second-rate power or third-rate, and Iran does not. That's why it wants to enrich its uranium. And there's a very clear here difference of views, which was obvious from day one. Of course, President Trump is still hopeful that something will come from these negotiations. But, of course, others are seeing that this is unlikely to occur. Israel is apparently thinking of attacking Iran, quite possibly with Donald Trump's support should the negotiations break down. And so what we're looking at is yet another possibility of a war with Iran, which would be most unfortunate, but it is very hard to see how they can possibly compromise, except just possibly. The Americans would agree to Iran's having peaceful nuclear weapons, and Iran would agree peaceful nuclear plants, peaceful nuclear power, and Iran would agree that its facilities will be under constant monitoring to allow to be seen whether there's any enrichment or not, and therefore it would pose no threat. That would be something of a compromise, but it would still mean that Iran would be treated in effect as a second or third-rate power.
And briefly, there are fears that if these talks collapse, Israel could launch its own attacks on Iran's nuclear facilities. And I imagine that's one of the reasons why the stakes are so high.
Yes, one of the problems that Iran faces is it can't stop the Israeli attacks. But again, it's only a question of time. In particular, they have an ally in the shape of Russia, who quite possibly could supply them with more equipment in this field. And therefore, it is by no means clear that Israel could carry on, so to speak, policing Iran forever. The point is, the Americans want the Iranians to stop all enrichment entirely. Iran's not prepared to do that. If Israel attacks, it will have an initial success, but in the medium term, this is a very potential serious war.
Dr. Laskiewicz, thank you very much indeed. Dr. Marek Laskiewicz is the international affairs analyst who was talking to me on the line from London.